It's not about luck. So you're saying, I know it takes money to make money, but you also got to have knowledge to make money.
Hey guys, welcome to the Pivot Point Trading Robot series, where we will be writing a complete, full-blown EA with tons of options. By the end of this entire series, you will be able to have an EA where you can have all of these options, which you can define whether you want to buy and sell on pounds or break of the pivot points, etc., etc. And you will be able to run it where the system is going to identify all the pivot points, support, resistance, and everything, and be able to open up trades and close trades and do exactly what you will ask it to. So let's get started with part 1, where we're going to set up all the pivot points. So we head to meta editor, and I have here a full pivot point EA. That's the folder that I'm going to create the entire thing in. Let's create an expert advisor and call it pivot point. This is our opening template. I'll clean it up. So we only have 3 functions. The initialization function, all the codes here are going to be run on the start of the EA. The deinitialization, where all the codes are going to be run at the stopping of the EA, and the on tick, which all the codes here are going to be run on every tick in MetaTrader. First thing first, we need to create the pivot point. And in order to create the pivot point, I want to know what the pivot points are going to be based on. Is it going to be based on daily time frame, or is it going to be based on weekly time frame, or is it going to be based on monthly time frame? Now, in order to do that, what I need is a user input where the user defines whether it's daily, weekly, monthly, or what's the time frame for the pivot point calculation. So I'm going to have to ask the user. In order to ask the user, I first have to create an enum, which is a variable type that you can define by yourself. You will understand as we go through the codes. So I'm creating the enum and I'm calling it time frame for pivot point, and I'm giving the user only 2 inputs: daily, which I'm assigning to value 0, and weekly, which I'm assigning to value 1. Now that I have created this variable type, now I can go ahead and ask the user for his input, giving him the options only daily and weekly. So I'm creating an input group and I'm calling it inputs for pivot points. This is the way of basically identifying or segregating different portions of the input, and you will see it later on when we will have more input needed from the user, that we can segregate it into different sections. But this is basically creating a section, and this section is called group input for pivot points. And I'm asking here the user to provide me 2 things. The first thing is I'm asking him to input a time frame, and the variable type is enum time frames, which is an MQL standard type. And I'm creating a variable and I'm calling it time frame for chart, and I'm saying it's period current, which means whatever is the period on the chart. And then I go ahead and ask, using the variable type that I've defined here, which is T4PP, time frame for PP. I'm using that variable type to define a variable, and I'm calling it the time frame for PP choice, and equals 0, meaning the default is daily. And this is where the user will be able to define whether he wants to select the weekly or the daily. Let's see it in action. Let's compile it. Once I compile it and go back to MetaTrader in the input sheet, now you can see that we have our input for pivot point section, which we created. We are asking for the time frame for the EA to run on. That's you can run it on 5 minutes chart, for example. And here I'm asking what's the time frame for the pivot points, and here the user only has 2 options, daily and weekly, the ones that we defined here. Now that I have that as well, then I have to create another variable, and I'm calling it the enum time frames PP time frame. And the idea is basically, once we have this variable type, then we ask the user to provide or to choose between these 2. So if he chooses 0, then it means it's daily. If it chooses 1, then it's 1. But then I need to pass it to MQL in a format that MQL can understand, and MQL can understand time frames. So I'm creating a variable enum time frames and calling it PP time frames. And this is where we will then pass on the information to say whether it's daily or weekly. And this we do by coming to initialization and saying that if TF for PP choice, so here the user has selected 0, if they have selected daily, then the PP time frame is going to be period day 1. And if they have selected the choice 1, which is the weekly, then PP time frame is going to be weekly. Once I have that, then the last thing I want the user to provide is a color for the pivot points to be drawn on the chart. So I'm asking them to input a color, and I'm assigning a value to the TL colors by myself, but then they can change it later. So if I compile it now and go back to MetaTrader, then we see basically these three. So the user has to provide the time frame for the year to run on, so whether it's running on 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, whatever chart. Then secondly, what's the time frame for the calculation of the pivot period, and they can choose daily or they can choose weekly. And then I'm asking them when we print the pivot points on the chart, what color do they want to see it in, and this is the default value. Now the next step is just my own personal preference. I don't like to see grid on the chart, so I'm going to turn it off by saying chart set integer and then using the show grid and turning it to false. Now I don't want to write all the codes in the onTick function because it gets crowded, so I'm going to create a separate function and I'm going to call it pivot points, and this is where we're gonna create the pivot points and do all the calculations around it. In order to calculate the pivot points, I need three things. I need the close of the last candle, I need the high of the last candle, and I need the low of the last candle. And by last candle, I mean whatever is the pivot point time frame that has been chosen, whether it's daily or weekly. Then I want the opening and the closing, and the closing, the high, and the low of that period, the daily or the weekly. So what I'm doing here is I'm creating a variable. I'm calling it pp close x1, so the last close of pp. And using the function iClose, I basically provide the symbol info. So this is the current chart, and then the pp time frame, which is the user selection, which we had defined here between daily and weekly. So if it's daily that the user has selected, then it's going to be a daily time frame, and then if it is weekly that they have selected, then it's going to be the pp time frame variable value is going to be week. So once I have these three values, I just follow the standard pivot point calculation formulas that you can find on the internet. So for example, pivot point is equals to the high of the period, the low of the period, plus the low of the period, plus the close of the period divided by 3. And then you can pause the video and you can see all the other formulas. You can find them on the internet as well. This is how standard pivot points are calculated. After this function, because I want to draw the pivot points on the chart, so I'm going to create a function, and it's a void function, so it's not going to return any value. I'm calling it draw pivot points, and the values that I will pass on to this function when I will call it, I want to pass on the pivot point value, the support 1, support 2, resistance 1, and resistance 2 values, the ones that we have calculated here. So I'll pass them to this function whenever I will call the function, and this is how I'm defining them. These are all double variables, so they can have decimals. Now that I have created this function, I still haven't populated it, but what I can do now is come here and basically say draw pivot points, and if I call this function, it's asking me for pp, s1, s2, r1, and r2 values. And those I can provide from here, the ones that I've calculated. So I've calculated the pivot point to be here, so I'm providing the pivot point value, then s1, then r2, s2, r1, and r2. So I'm sending all these values to this function. So once this function pivot point has calculated these values, I send these values to draw pivot points so that those can be drawn on the chart. So now let's start creating here. And the way to create is basically to create an object by using the function object create. And when you open the bracket, it asks you for values. So the first thing it's asking you is which chart to create this on. So we're passing on the value 0, which means the current main chart. Then it asks me what the name of the object should be. Let's call it PP. Then it asks me what kind of an object is, and I say object trend. Then it asks me which sub window to create it in. Well, we don't want a sub window, so create it in the main one. Then it asks me, okay, what's the date and time where the line should start from? And this is where I'm going to use the iTime function, which gives me the opening of a candle, the time of the opening of a candle. So what I'm saying here is get for the current symbol, so whichever chart we are on, based on the PP time frame. So if it's daily, then daily, and if it's weekly, then weekly. Get the opening time of the current candle by saying 0. So the current candle, if I say 1, then it's 1 candle back, 2 candles back is 2. So I'm providing 0, which is the current candle, which basically means start this line, that the object that I'm creating as an object trend. This line is started at the opening of the bar of the current pivot period, which is either weekly or daily. The next thing the function asks me is for a price. So I mean, if one is the time, so which is the x-axis, but then on the y-axis, where on the price. So I want to draw this line on the pivot point. Then it asks me, okay, until what time do I want it? And this is where I use the iTime function again. But this time what I say is get for the symbol, the PP time frame 0. So basically the starting point of our candle of the current time frame for the pivot point calculation, plus the period seconds of the time frame. So if the time frame is daily, convert it into seconds and then add it to the time where we started. If the time frame is weekly, then use a week, get all the seconds, how many seconds are there in a week by using this function, and then add it to the opening of the current candle for the current time frame for pivot point. So if it's a weekly pivot point, then our starting point is the opening of the week, and then our end time is the closing of the week, because we're adding to the opening of the week, we're adding the number of seconds in a week. And then the last thing I need to provide is what is the price for the line at the ending point. So I need to provide the price for the opening point and the ending point. So from the beginning, from the end, and in both cases, because it's a straight line for us, so it's the PP, pivot point value, and pivot point value at the end. So this is how I create this object. And once the object is created, I can set its values. So I use the function object set integer to set a value. I provide the same name as the name here. So I'll create this object, and then to this object, what I want to change the property of the object color, and then I want to assign it the TL color, which is the color that we have asked the user to provide. So this is how the system is going to create the pivot point once it has calculated it, and then it will assign it the color that the user has inputted. Now, before I go on and create the objects for S1, S2, resistance 1 and resistance 2, I want to test it. So I come here, and on tick, I'm just going to call the function pivot points. So on every tick, the function pivot point is going to be called. The system is going to come here, calculate the pivot points, and then it's going to call the draw pivot point function, pass on these values. And in this function, it will create the object pivot point, and that's what we're going to. So let's compile it and run it. When I run it, I should see now the pivot points, and they are being calculated for the daily time frame. And once it crosses the daily time frame, there's a new day, then the pivot point for the previous day is calculated again. So the function is working. Now, using the same logic, I'm creating the next line, which is the support one, and I'm passing on the value of, again, the same opening time. Then I want to pass on the value, which is support one. Then the closing time is exactly the same as the previous line, and then the price of the closing is also S1. And then I also set the color of this by using exactly the same function to the same color. Then additionally, I'm setting these three values as well. So I'm creating another object, calling it object create, and I'm calling it S1 text. And I want a text, so I'm saying it's an object text. And on the 0 main, or I'm passing on the value 0, which means the main frame on the main chart. And then again at the same time, which is the same period, or the opening of the same candle, and then I'm passing on the value S1. So create this new object, and this is going to be text, and I want the text of this text box to be S1, and I want the color to be the TL color. So now if I run it again, what I'm going to see now is two lines, the pivot points and the support line, and now we have a small text here saying it's S1. Now I just have to repeat the same thing again for R1 line, S2 line, and R2 line. So I'm just copy pasting exactly the same thing, S1 from here, the S1, and I'm pasting it here, and just changing the variable that the name of this object is S2, and the name of the object text box is S2 text, and then I'm passing on the value S2, I'm calling it S2 as well, the text and the color, and here as well. So if you just copy paste the formulas, and now instead of S1, just say S2 here everywhere, then R1, then R2, compile it again, and if you run it, now we should see all the lines. So here we go. For the pivot point, because we haven't created a text box because I don't like to see it, but in case of R1, S1, the system is creating the lines, and let's see if there is a line which is closer to, which is compressed, so we see all of it in one place. going to speed it up. And here we go. So the system is working. It's creating the pivot points. It's creating the support and resistance level. It's marking it. And on the change of every day, whenever there is a new bar, so the system calculates the previous day's pivot point, then it charts it up on the chart. So this is for the part 1. In the next series, we're going to start to look at, okay, well, how do we start trading these lines? And we will look at how to trade a break of the resistance line or support line, and also how to trade the bounce, and how do we provide the user the input to select whether he wants to trade bounce from these lines or he wants to trade the break of these lines. So until next time, guys, leave a comment, hit the subscribe button, press the notification bell so you don't miss anything, and leave a comment. It will help me understand how to make these videos in a better way, whether there's something that I'm missing, if I'm going too fast or too slow, and what else would you like me to cover. So until next time, stay safe, trade safe.